now we move into the PCV system. PCV is an acronym for Positive Crankcase Ventilation. In the 1964 model year, EPA mandated the PCV valve in the PCV system. Prior to that, crankcase gases were just vented to the atmosphere, to the ground. The PCV valve captures the blow-by gases, the combustion stuff that slips past the piston rings, which are imperfect and cannot possibly seal 100%. And then those gases are recycled back into the air intake charge to be burnt by the engine. Now, recycling PCV gases back in increase hydrocarbon and carbon monoxide and the exhaust gases. So why would EPA say, let's make the exhaust gases worse? Because the stuff that was being dumped out, the crankcase gases that were being dumped out before, were way more toxic than the exhaust gas increase. So the overall reduction in pollution went down dramatically. So the crankcase gases have heavy oils, acids, water vapor, and a bunch of other stuff. Carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide. They get recycled back into the air intake to reduce total pollution. But what can we do to help that out? Well, first of all, there's certain engines, Chrysler V6 comes to mind, where the PCV hose goes right at the oil filler cap. And when you fill up the engine with oil, invariably some of it runs down that hose. So right after an oil change, you're a gross polluter. Well, the catalytic converter is being taxed all to hell. Well, it's really not good for anybody or anything. In fact, sloppy oil changers are causing clogged catalytic converters and so forth, because that just gets sucked right into the throttle body, because that's where the other end of that hose goes. And if you get an older engine that has a lot of blow-by, you're going to get more oils. You're going to get more of the stuff that doesn't burn very well in combustion. More of the stuff that drags combustion down. And so what can we do to improve upon that? Well, one thing is, let's just try to, filter out the crap. This is just a little steel container. I don't have the fittings on it, but it is something that I had modified as a PCV catch can. This one I started to. This is what it looked like when it was done. So you can see it'll have a little sight tube on the side. So if I get too much in there, I know I have to go empty it. And then you have like an inlet and an outlet. So the inlet would have a tube inside that would take it down close to the bottom. Inside there would be like a stainless steel pot scrubber, the kind you get at the grocery store where they got, your cleaning supplies. You just shove one or two down in there, and that will act like a wick. So the oils and stuff, they get sent down to the bottom, and as they try to come back up, they attach, they cling to that stainless steel pot scrubber, and it pulls them out of suspension, so that what you wind up sending to the engine is much cleaner. And usually for a normal engine, you would empty this about every oil change. I think on the one that's in the picture, I put an extra hole in the bottom and put a little like petcock where I could have a drain. So I would have a hose coming off the bottom. I'd have my oil pan underneath the vehicle already to drain the oil, catch the drippings from the filter, just crack that thing open and just let the oil run out into the drain pan. Shut the valve and good to go. As we were talking off camera, you had brought up a fuel catalyst type of arrangement where you're using dissimilar metals, catalyst materials, and there's electron transfer, which helps to destabilize the fuel before it hits the fuel injectors. There's a product called the Smart Emissions Reducer. Thank you, kind gentlemen. It goes in the PCV hose, and it has dissimilar metals inside of it. And so once you filter out the worst of the crap with the PCV catch can, those gases could then go into something like a Smart Emissions Reducer, which will fracture and ionize the large heavy hydrocarbon elements into smaller, more digestible, combustible ones before they go back in the engine to be burnt. And this is a product that I have professionally worked with. I have overseen laboratory testing, wrote the protocol, wrote the report. We did a test at Freeco Labs in Western Pennsylvania where we analyzed what was coming out of the engine with an atomic mass spectrometer, and then we analyzed what was coming out of the smart emissions reducer, and it really surprised me just how effective this little guy was. There was a substantial amount of ionization and fracturing of the larger hydrocarbon elements. So it makes that stuff that normally detracts from combustion more combustible, so it'll improve fuel economy. It reduces emissions, smart emissions reducer, and in many cases you can actually feel a performance increase. Now, the way the PCV system works is you have two hoses, one with the PCV valve that goes to manifold vacuum, and the PCV valve is just going to kind of regulate flow, and then the other hose goes to the air cleaner. Fresh air, filtered air, comes in and down into the engine to replace the blow-by gases that are being drawn out by engine vacuum through the PCV valve. And it's a cross-flow system. So like on an old V8 or V6, you would have the breather on one side and the PCV valve on the other. So you're drawing in fresh air, it goes through the engine, comes back out, and all the crap gas goes into the base of the carburetor, throttle body, as applicable. Ron, the Gadget Manhattan, decided, well, you know what? What would happen if you just plugged the breather side? Now you're going to put a vacuum on the crankcase. Moroso, which is a performance aftermarket manufacturer, has a belt drive pump that's used on high-end race cars that puts a vacuum on the crankcase. It's a vacuum pump, and it connects to the valve covers and just sucks the air out. And it puts a vacuum on the crankcase. Now, why would that be beneficial? Well, from a practical standpoint, if you have an older engine with a leaky rear main seal, normal driving, you're just dripping a little bit of oil here and there out through that seal. But if you've got a vacuum on the crankcase, now it's going to suck just a little bit of air in through that seal instead of leaking oil. So you reduce your oil consumption that way. But back to combustion, remember, one of the conversions is pressure to kinetic. So we're taking heat, creating pressure on the top side of the piston, and that pressure pushes down. Well, the only way it can push down is because there's more pressure on top than there is on the bottom. If we reduce the pressure down here, wouldn't that be the same as increasing the pressure up here? So by putting a vacuum on the crankcase, while our combustion event is trying to push the piston down, now we've got vacuum trying to suck the piston down. So we actually get better performance out of it. Now, the question is, can we ever do it? Sometimes. If you have a fresh engine, fresh gaskets, fresh seals, you're probably okay. But if you have an older engine, you have a marginal gasket or seal that's just kind of mostly doing its job, and you put a strong vacuum on there, it can literally suck it in, and now you created a leak where there wasn't one. So there are a couple of ways where you can regulate the vacuum. In my hands, I hold what is called the N valve. It's EN-valve. This would replace the PCV valve. This larger part goes into the valve cover. So this bottom is exposed to your crankcase, and then this part goes to your manifold vacuum, base of the throttle body. Then there's a little pinhole here on top. This will regulate 5 inches, I want to say, of vacuum, no more. So when the manifold vacuum tries to put more than 5 inches of vacuum down here, it'll start bleeding air through here. What I don't like about this is that the air that it's sucking in is unfiltered. So you could be sucking dirty air in. You could be on a dusty, I don't know, someone who lives in the country and has a half-mile dirt lane, and they're sucking in all kinds of dust. So another way that I thought about is a vacuum regulator. I got this from McMaster Car, I think. So this is the plug on the fresh air side. So you have your PCV hose from the valve to the throttle body, stock, unmodified. On the other side, where you would normally have a hose that goes to the air cleaner, you run this in the middle. So this will regulate vacuum. Now, if you get more vacuum than you've regulated, it'll draw air from the air cleaner the same way it did normal stock. Now, how would you know how much vacuum you have on the crankcase? Can you put a gauge on it? Actually, yes. That's a dipstick tube. So you pull the dipstick out, you got that tube there, you just take a mechanic's vacuum gauge, and you slide the hose down over your dipstick tube, fire it up idle, and then watch the gauge and turn your valve until you get the desired vacuum. Any questions on the PCV system?
So if you pull too much vacuum, you also could be just pulling additional oil out of the engine, like you're actually promoting?
I've not found that.
Okay.
If you have a lousy baffling system, if anything, you'll pull less, because when you have an open air inlet, the velocity of cross flow would be higher than if you just clamp that shut. Clamping that shut, you're getting a more static vacuum on the crankcase instead of a cross flow. If you have lousy baffling, then yeah, I mean, I suppose could.
And if you have lousy baffling, then you have one of those engines that sucks oil right back into the intake manifold, and it's pooling in the intake manifold somewhere, you should just be using a catch can basically for something like that if it has lousy baffling, where you can actually.
Right. Like the.
Then you could go on that with the other.
Yeah, like the V6 Chrysler that I had mentioned with the PCV coming right off the oil filler area. What I did on the Jeep, I should include this, is Ron Hatton said just cap the fresh air side. And my concern was I have 233,000 miles on it, and if I get into a situation where I got to pounce that throttle, it's a safety issue. I got to get up and moving right now. Will the blow-by be so excessive that it cannot get through the normal PCV system? Will I start creating pressure inside? What I did was I took a power brake booster check valve, and it flows out but not in. So if I get pressure in the crankcase, it'll vent outward, but as long as there's no pressure, it just shuts off. Power brake booster check valve.